One of the new paradigms of literary criticism that has become especially popular in Joyce studies is that of genetic criticism. And genetic criticism in its current form is a reaction to Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. Roland Barthes says that the author is an effect of the text, something that cannot be concretely located beyond the text because the author must transmit his or her intentions, and in fact his or her identity itself, into the text, and we as the reader get a mediated version of who the author is. And we know through ideology and through propaganda that often the author can be twisted and turned in such a way that we get a sense of intentions that are in fact mere images that are not true. This is a postmodern observation that has motivated studies in manuscript studies that tries to maintain the relationship between the author and the text as one of an active interplay in which the author is itself constantly reacting to his or her image from the text. And in many of the works that I've seen genetic criticism being used, among the most intriguing is Dirk Van Hulle's Joyce's Work in Progress, in which he looks at the pre-book publications of Finnegans' Wake Fragments and looks at the way that Joyce reacts to his critics and to the way his authorial persona is mediated in the text in order to change the drafts of his texts. Because Joyce had a very sophisticated method by which he would alter his texts, going back and forth between these great Buffalo notebooks, as they're known today, because they're stored at the University of Buffalo. And he would go back and forth between these, constantly jotting down ideas and using these notebooks as a constant artifact in the world, extending Joyce's thought process from something that no longer just merely takes place in the head, but, as Van Hulle wants to say, is embodied and enacted and extended into the world. Van Hulle wants to introduce some concepts from cognitive philosophy, such as the extended cognition model of thinking, in which thinking and intelligence are not just brain-bound actions, but rather they are embodied in and intricately related to the environment. This is admittedly a rather belated theoretical realization of the philosophy of the American pragmatists or Martin Heidegger, who understands thinking as not bound to a subject-object dualism, a Cartesian form of thinking in which I am an isolated individual put against a world of objects which I am alienated from and need to represent. Instead, Heidegger and the American pragmatists understand us as constantly being thrown into a world which is already there, in which we are already socially absorbed, in which my active thinking is inseparable from those norms and cultural contexts, or the Umwelt, as Van Hulle wants to put it, which is a concept that Heidegger uses a lot. Therefore, Van Hulle wants to look at the thought process and the evolving intention and identity of Joyce through this publication process of Finnegans' Wake, which takes about 16 years. Immediately after Ulysses, Joyce gets started on writing and drafting various stuff for Finnegans' Wake, but it doesn't start out as Finnegans' Wake. In fact, it is called Work in Progress for the majority of its drafting period up until the time when the text comes together as a complete text. And while Joyce always understood that he was creating fragments, building up to some kind of text, we see that through the publication process of, for example, the Anna Livia Plurabelle chapter, the final chapter of part 1 of the book, as well as Haveth Childers Everywhere, among other fragments, these were seen as autonomous texts of their own, that they could stand on their own in publication, and therefore, while they are part of a larger aesthetic patchwork, they also have their own methods of, for example, riffing on nursery rhymes and stories and myths in ways that are very interesting. In September of 1926, Joyce wrote to his patron, Harriet Shaw Weaver, who really helped assist in the publication process and in the financial backings of Joyce. He wrote that he wanted Fragments of Work in Progress to, quote, appear slowly and regularly in a prominent place. And that was the goal of Joyce, was to have some sense of the progression of work as an interplay between the individual and his social environment, such that these were inextricably connected. And this indeed blends the publication process with the form and content of the finalized Finnegans Wake that we have today, in such a way that, for example, HCE in Finnegans Wake has been accused of a crime in Phoenix Park. It is illicit or lewd in some manners, and his wife ALP comes to his rescue to try to defend him through the creation of a letter, which is in fact a mediated transmission of a letter written by Sean, one of the children of HCE. And all of this is a convoluted way of trying to avoid this game by which history is told through narrative. And Joyce is very interested in the relationship between the artifacts that we create, namely the literary aesthetic edifices that we produce, like books, and the lives that we live beyond the books. And there's a constant interplay here because Joyce is so inundated with language. You can see this from the beginning of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where the young Stephen Dedalus is all concerned with words and the way that certain words sound and roll off the tongue, and this gets riffed on in all sorts of interesting ways in Finnegans Wake. But nevertheless, Joyce was interested in the way that the self is not just innocently there, but rather constantly being mediated by the social and being informed by the disparity between one's self-image and the image of the persona that exists and is circulated socially. Therefore, there's constantly this circular hermeneutic interplay between the interpretation of the way one sees oneself and the sense of self-identity, the self-schema that one creates for themselves, the ideals one has for oneself. And HCE is always trying to struggle with this. And in fact, this leads to a lot of interesting struggles in the development and publication of work in progress. For example, Wyndham Lewis is a famous critic who is extremely critical of Joyce's project throughout, critical of him and Gertrude Stein, and says, for example, that Gertrude Stein and Joyce's methods are, quote, a literary system that consists in a sort of gargantuan mental stutter. And Joyce knew that this was written about him, and he takes this into Finnegans Wake and creates the stuttering main character, HCE. He adds the stutter, which was not there before. And this stutter is supposed to symbolize guilt. It is a pause or a rut in the cognitive processes, in the imaginative capacities of HCE that causes him to stumble over his words, just as, for example, we constantly stumble over certain problems that we tend to repeat in history. Therefore, these historical understandings blend with the biographical details of Joyce's life as he's trying to produce Finnegans Wake, or rather Work in Progress, and therefore he uses this mediation between him and his critics for the production of a text. And Joyce eventually gets regular publications in the journal Transition. And Transition is this up-and-coming avant-garde journal who Joyce becomes a prominent publisher within. And we get this in the third volume of Transition, which Van Hulle writes about in a very interesting way, and I just kind of want to read what he has to say. First, we have the passage, which is as follows. The data, did we possess them, are too few to warrant certitude. The testifiers too irreparable, but certain it is that we ere winter turned the leaves of the book of nature, the shade of the great outlander had stood at the bar of the 100 tribunals. The heroic shade looms up big, human, erring, forgivable behind the varied speeches of his fellow men and women. Now we might ask here, what does this data point to? What is this data about? Well, it could be the author, could be the plot, could be the characters, could be the intention behind the creation of the text. All of this has been obliquely covered away, such that we can never have full warrant or certitude in saying anything certain about the text. And this indeed is a preemptive understanding of the death of the author, of an obscurity that is reached and a realization of the connection between ontology and hermeneutics, between states of being and the narratives used to talk about those states of being and the interpretation involved in reading those narratives, such that we cannot say certain things about the world which is textually mediated and itself is a constant process. And this doesn't mean that there is no world beyond the text. Indeed, there is a real James Joyce, and there is the James Joyce who we get some senses about through the text. But these are so intimately related because Joyce is indeed an author. Language is part of who he is, that we really get a understanding of a postmodern point about the relationship between humans and the narratives that they use. And Van Hulle says, this passage makes the book's structural concept of the rumors explicit. Sylvia Beach mentions in Shakespeare and Company that Joyce compared history to that parlor game where someone whispers something to the person next to him, who repeats it not very distinctly to the next person, and so on, until by the time the last person hears it, it comes out completely transformed. The idea to work with the shade of a character, which looms behind the varied speeches of his fellow men and women, was inspired by Joyce's notes on a series of street interviews in the Daily Sketch of the 14th of December 1922, a source discovered by Vincent Dean. The interviews were part of a petition regarding the trial of Frederick Bywaters, who murdered the husband of his beloved Edith Thompson. He received the death penalty on the 9th of January 1923, and so did Edith Thompson, as an accessory to the murder. One of the street interviews in the Daily Sketch suggests that she was actually more to blame than Bywaters himself. Quote, 3 soldiers were walking together in Fleet Street. One gave an opinion in which all concurred. It was the woman who was to blame. Bywaters played a bad part in the crime, but he was coerced. He proved himself a man afterwards. After Joyce had excerpted this passage in his notebook, it took him a year to discover its potential and develop it in his draft of Chapter 1.3 in the Guiltless notebook. Quote, 3 soldiers of the Coldstream Guards were walking in Montgomery Street. One gave an opinion in which all concurred. It was the women, they said. He showed himself a man afterwards. The woman, singular, became women, plural. And whereas Bywaters proved himself a man in the text of the Daily Sketch, HCE showed himself a man. In the first typescript, he first showed himself a man, then man was crossed out and replaced by private. And eventually the whole sentence, he showed himself a private afterwards, was crossed out. If HCE's crime was that he exposed himself to 2 girls in Phoenix Park, it is significant that Joyce decided to undo this sentence, alluding to how HCE showed himself a man, and to the ambiguous private part. This would imply that the cancellation was an instance of creative undoing. The hesitation, first making the crime explicit, then undoing it, resulted in a cancellation that created the void upon which Joyce built the wake, which is what Shem is being accused of in Chapter 1.7. You have reared your kingdom upon the void of your very more than doubtful soul. You have reared your disunited kingdom on the vacuum of your own most intensely doubtful soul. By creating this gap of indeterminacy, Joyce fully exploited the narrative device which Wolfgang Iser called Leerstelle. The Wake's motto, "In the beginning is the void," is evidently much more than a mere pun. From the perspective of cognitive narratology, it is the very engine of fiction, the narrative drive that mobilizes readers' knowledge and experience to supplement what is left unsaid. Narratives come into being through the interaction between minds and narrative gaps. In Work in Progress, Joyce thematizes this gap-filling activity undertaken not only by readers, but also by fictional minds. What applies to history, the Chinese whispers mechanism of the parlor game mentioned by Sylvia Beach, simultaneously applies to the notion of the mind. Joyce's History of the World is also at the same time a story of a world, the Umwelt of a fictional mind. So there's a fantastic interplay here between Joyce the man and Joyce the projected authorial persona and Joyce the embodied fictional persona in both HCE and Shem the penman. And thus we have this cycle-wheeling concept of history, as it's put in Finnegans' Wake, whereby we cannot get behind the text, but we can see that the text is constantly fragmented, constantly partial, constantly leaving behind cinders, as Derrida would put it. And I think this is a very productive way of looking at the author, because in genetic criticism, what is being done is we are tracking the history of the text not as the text, but as a series of different texts, which need not be teleologically related in that the first is worse than the last. Rather, we track the differences in these manuscripts in order to understand the development of the author through the intentionality that we can see embodied in the materiality of the text. We see the thought processes through the changes of the text, through the fragmentary nature of the text, because if we know the history of the text, we know that the final is partial. It only gives us part of the story. And by going back and giving a kind of genealogical account of the text, we do what Nietzsche does in his genealogical account, which is we undo the idea of teleological transcendence, of absolutes, but through doing so, we get a much more clear understanding of the material implications behind any creative process. And while this is only the most cursory understanding of this book, I mean, I could go on forever talking about the way in which these different pieces were drafted and the complications of publishing various editions at various prices and whatnot. But the point here is that by having this historical eye to the text that sees not the text, but a text here and a text here, it uses the indefinite article and understands, therefore, every text as indefinite, not having solid boundaries, but rather a sort of fuzzy aggregate, an assemblage with lines of flight peeking out of it all over the place. I think we get a much more productive understanding of the genesis of the creative project. And if you're really interested in genetic criticism, you can check out Dirk Van Hulle, and you can also check out Daniel Ferré, who is another really interesting genetic critic, and they're very popular in Joyce studies. That being said, that's it for this very short lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. You can check out any of my other ones I've done on German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. And you can also become a channel member for $5 a month if you would like to donate anything to the channel, because books, especially this one, are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. Keep out for yourself first. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.